Thank you. So I figure you all are here either because you read the blurb about me or you came for lunch, but it doesn't really matter. You're here, and thank you for coming. And I want to thank David Morris and Roberto Suro for inviting me. It's nice to be back on this campus. It's changed a lot since I was here, but it's a place that has a lot of fond memories for me. Also want to acknowledge Rich Sundin, who's a longtime friend and colleague, and my wife worked in the School of Public Administration here before it was folded into the Price School. So we have a lot of connections with USC and my family. So I'm going to talk for 30 minutes or so, as David said. 3 points. One, we aspire to a democracy that represents people's interests and is accountable to people. But what we know is that government is often not accountable to people of color and low-income people. That's a problem. The second, in order to change that, we have to engage a broader swath of the population in voting. And we need to, in a number of cases, change the people who are making the decisions, not only change the policies, but actually change the policy makers. And third, in order to do that, we have to go beyond traditional philanthropy on the one hand and traditional political organizations on the other. Traditional philanthropy is bound by tax law as to what it can do. Political organizations want to get people elected, don't care much about anything else. And there's a place in the middle where political philanthropy can bridge that gap. So I want to talk to you about that. I don't need to spend a lot of time on the fact that government isn't unrepresentative or is unrepresentative. I think the Affordable Care Act, which Atlantic Philanthropies was the largest single philanthropic funder to get that law passed. It gave 20 million people, many of them low-income people, people of color, health insurance. Many states, though, under that law decided not to expand Medicaid, which is a way to cover low-income people. And now what we see is a dismantling of that. And the current tax law that is being debated in Congress would take away insurance for some 13 million of those people. So government is not only not responsive, it's actually can be really destructive and hurtful to people. The criminal justice system, there are 2.2 million people that are incarcerated in this country. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. Much of that is because of prosecutors. Prosecutors determine who gets prosecuted and what the conditions are and the terms. There are a lot of prosecutors out there that are just about tough on crime, lock them up, whether it's low-level drug crimes or whether they have mental health issues. And the only way to change that is to change the prosecutors. So the source of the problem is that the political environment has changed pretty dramatically over the past several decades. And we know that the rise of mega donors, the decline of labor unions, the decline of the political parties has all contributed to a different kind of much more partisan environment and an environment that's much more responsive to money and less responsive to the public. Just to give you an example from my own experience, when I started with the Alzheimer's Association in 1989, opened their public policy office, we could get a lot of mileage with Congress by just making the case, putting a face on the disease, stating what the facts were. We got lots of interest by members of Congress just by doing that. We got increased funding for research. But after a few years, that kind of lost traction. So then we focused on people with early onset Alzheimer's, which is a fairly uncommon thing, people in their 40s and 50s that get the disease, but it's very dramatic. And so we'd make that case, and members of Congress who were in the 40s and 50s themselves would look at these people and say, oh my gosh, they're but for the grace of God. So we got traction for a while with that. That waned. So then we focused on people actually with the disease and brought them in to testify, and that was helpful for a while. But eventually, what we realized is that we had to create the Alzheimer's Association, nonpartisan organization. Nobody's against Alzheimer's. We had to create a political action committee to get any attention in Congress, because the nature of the congressional environment, the political environment had changed. If you weren't able to put money on the table, either to threaten somebody's reelection or to help them get reelected, it was very hard to get your issue in front of them. So that's just by way of an example of what has changed over just the course of time that I've been working in this field. So why political philanthropy? On the one hand, as I say, you have traditional foundations that can make the case, much like we did with Alzheimer's, but they can't, in many cases, support lobbying. They can't get involved in electoral politics at all. And on the other hand, you have political organizations that crank up their efforts around election time, focused on a few candidates, get those candidates elected, and then disappear. And what you've got is a declining part of the population that's engaged in elections, that show up to vote, because nobody's building a relationship with them. Nobody's convincing them that there's a reason why their vote matters. So into that, so just by way of background, to understand what the constraints are. So the tax code determines what organizations can and can't do. So there's, in the tax code, 501c3 category, which applies to most nonprofits. In the philanthropy world, there are private foundations. And private foundations are 501c3 organizations where there's a single donor. And if you're a private foundation, you can engage in no lobbying. You can't do anything electoral. There are also 501c3 philanthropic organizations that are public charities. So like the Los Angeles Community Foundation, where they get multiple donors. They can engage in lobbying, but no electoral activity. If you're getting, if the contributions to your organization are tax deductible, there are limits, significant limits on what you can do, and you can't do anything that's related to elections. Then there's the 501c4 category of the tax code. It applies to social welfare organizations. My organization is a 501c4. Contributions are not tax deductible. So it's harder money to raise, but the government says you can do unlimited lobbying and you can even get involved in elections. You can't coordinate with candidates. You can't give money to candidates or coordinate with them, but you can help elect a candidate or defeat a candidate. And there are a fair number of those kinds of organizations out there. There are not very many funders that are 501c4. Most C4 money comes from individuals. And a lot of individuals don't like to give money to a 501c4 because they don't get a tax deduction for it. But if you want to have an impact on this political environment, you need to be able to influence elections. There are also 501c5 organizations, which are labor unions. C6s are business leagues. Then there are 527s that are PACs and super PACs and so forth, but we won't get into that. Private foundations, Ford Foundation is a private foundation, so it can't support lobbying. Open Society Foundation, and Rockefeller, those are all private foundations. Public charities, I mentioned, like community foundations are public foundations. They receive money from a wide range of people. C4 organizations, there are some 90,000 of them. So AARP is a 501c4. They are supported by people's membership. The ACLU, the NRA, those are all 501c4 organizations. They have no limits on lobbying, and they can get involved in electoral activity. Many of them choose not to on the electoral side, but they can. So the Civic Participation Action Fund, which I'll refer to as CPAP from now on because it's a mouthful. When we created the name, we were trying to come up with a name that nobody would remember because we didn't really care that, that we got any attention. So CPAP is a social welfare organization. We can spend up to half of our resources on electoral activity. We can't spend all of our money on it. We have the rest of it has to be, the bulk of what we do has to be in the social welfare category. But we're allowed to invest in elections, and we do. we're trying to bridge that gap between traditional philanthropy and political organizations. And our goal is to improve the human condition by increasing civic participation among people of color and low-income people. So to talk about this in what I know about social innovation, which I read about just a week or so ago, is that the process of coming up with this innovation, if you will, is we looked at traditional philanthropy and realized the advantages it had, but also the limitations. And the tax code really sets those limitations. And to use a USC football analogy, if the USC football team could only advance the ball to the 20-yard line, they wouldn't win very many games. They might kick an occasional field goal, but they're not going to win games. Traditional philanthropy can get the ball to the 20-yard line, but in much of public policy, they can't move it across because they don't have the tools available to them to advance these issues to completion. So that's on the one hand. The partisan political organizations that I said, the political parties, organizations that are about getting somebody elected, they tend to come on the scene a few months, maybe even a year in advance, but it's all about that election, getting somebody elected. Whatever it takes, they pick off the voters that are the most likely to vote, and they focus on them, and they just ignore everybody else. They don't build relationships in the community, and as a result, they're not as successful as they could be in engaging the population, particularly the people that we care about, which is people of color or low-income people. So, the product that we came up with is something called integrated voter engagement. This is a concept that is relatively new, but so think about what typical advocacy organizations do. They push an issue. So maybe it's the environment, and they do all the work around educating the public and lobbying or whatever they do around advancing that issue. But they don't get involved in electoral activity. And then you have other organizations that focus on civic engagement. It's all about voter registration and getting out the vote and persuasion and so forth, but they're not issue-oriented. Integrated voter engagement is bringing those two concepts together. So it's issue organizations working in the community, building relationships with that community, but at the and advancing issues, but at the same time encouraging people to vote. At the end of the day, if you're not voting, if you haven't built local political power, you can only move your issues so far. So this concept of integrated voter engagement is what we support, and we're supporting it with 501c4 dollars, which means that they can actually engage in elections, they can endorse candidates, they can support candidates, as long as it's done as independent expenditures. So IVE, integrated voter engagement, long-term relationship with voters. They become a trusted messenger so that when they ask somebody to vote, people will pay attention to it, unlike what happens in many cases with organizations just promoting a candidate. They give people something of value. They can engage in electoral politics, and they focus, at least the organizations we support, focus on the rising American electorate, people of color, low-income people, millennials. So in California, there's a good example of an organization that does this really well. It's called California Calls. And they're a consortium of local community groups across the state. Those community groups have been working in their communities for many years, building relationships. And last election cycle in 2016, there was a Proposition 55, which extended a tax increase on wealthy people that is targeted to education and a variety of things. That was about to expire, and this organization went out and mobilized people around that proposition. We funded some of that work, and we had some researchers come in and take a look at it and say, what was their impact? And among the people who were supporters, were people connected with these community organizations, 24% of them who voted were low propensity voters. These were people who generally don't vote. So they managed to mobilize people who are not likely voters. Among people that they had repeated contact with, 74% of them voted and voted yes on Prop 55. And what the research found is it wasn't one contact or two contacts. Contacts are usually, talking to somebody at their door, knocking on the door, talking to them about Prop 55. Two contacts wasn't enough. It took three or more. And I think that's another indication of you have to have a relationship with people. You have to have some connection, something of lasting value to get people to participate in the electoral system. So when we started out and created this organization from Atlantic Philanthropies, we had three issue areas that we focused on initially. One was economic opportunity. We passed some ballot initiatives on minimum wage in Arizona and Colorado and Maine. Those were successful, but we realized that there are some limitations. You can't do ballot initiatives in every state. You can't do ballot issues on lots of issues. It's not a particularly good way to run a government. But that was our focus initially. Criminal justice reform, we focused on prosecutors. We got rid of some bad prosecutors and got good progressive prosecutors elected in Mississippi, Louisiana, New Mexico, Texas, and in Illinois, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in a minute. And then on civic engagement was our third area. And we've put resources into voter registration and getting out the vote. And we studied the effects of that and realized that most of that work, voter registration work, can be done by 501c3, by traditional philanthropy. The only reason you need a C4, which allows you to be more political, is if you want to target a very narrow part of the population, African Americans who always vote Democratic, living in South Los Angeles, or so then you can't use tax-deductible money for that. But what we found is that it just wasn't worth it. You can do most of that work with tax-deductible dollars, so let that larger pool of money focus on voter registration. Getting out the vote can require more C4 type resources, but we just felt that those three areas that we had initially focused on, much of that work either had limitations or could be done by other kinds of philanthropy. So we decided to do what only C4 organizations can do, and that's the electoral work. And we decided to narrow our focus to a few states. So we're now funding in Arizona and Florida, focused on Latino populations, in Georgia and Virginia on African Americans, and in New Mexico on Hispanics and Native Americans. So to try to increase their voter engagement and to begin to change the makeup of legislatures in those states so they'll be more responsive. So our goals are increasing voter engagement among people of color, building up the organizations in the community that have relationships with those people, and winning elections. Basically, we hold ourselves accountable to all three of those goals. So 3 examples, and then I'll stop. On the DA issue, the district attorney issue, which we are doing now in the context of our state work, we put money into a race in Cook County, Illinois, which is Chicago. It's the largest prosecutor, second largest prosecutor office in the country, 900 attorneys, 1,600 staff. They have very high incarceration rates there. And the state's attorney at the time was Anita Alvarez. She had been a tough on crime prosecutor. She had lost the faith of the community. And then along came a case that you've heard about involving a kid named Laquan McDonald, 17-year-old African-American kid who was shot 16 times by a police officer as he was walking away from him, and they had it on the camera, which they did not disclose for a year until they were forced to disclose it. It almost cost the mayor, Rahm Emanuel, his job. It cost a number of other people their jobs. But in that context, the community said, we need a different kind of prosecutor, a different kind of set of policies here. And there was a woman named Kim Fox who'd spent 12 years in the prosecutor's office. She had a good reputation. She developed innovative programs. The community got behind her. We invested in those community groups that then vetted her, endorsed her, went out into the community and convinced people to vote for her. She won with 58% of the vote to Anita Alvarez's 24%. And it's important that those groups were involved in getting her elected, but even more importantly, they're there now, having endorsed her. She knows that she owes her election in part to those groups. She has to be accountable to them, and they're going to hold her accountable, because there's a lot of pressure on a prosecutor from police unions and lots of other places. And so those local community groups, all made up of people of color, are working to hold this prosecutor accountable. So that's one example of our work. A second is in Virginia, with these elections that just happened in November, early November. Virginia is a very weird state, so they have elections every year. Most states have elections in even years. The federal government positions are even years, but Virginia has elections every year. So in this year, 2017, the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and the entire House of Delegates were up for re-election or election. The governor is term limited, so it was an open seat. And Virginia is also unique in that you can coordinate with candidates. The only state where you can coordinate between the nonprofit sector and the political sector. So like I said, in general, our funding can't be coordinated with candidates. We can have independent expenditures, but in Virginia we could coordinate. They have a very strong base of organizations led by an organization called the New Virginia Majority. They have a 501c4 table that brings together all of the advocacy organizations with clear plans, electoral strategy. They have a donor table of local donors that support this work. So we invested early because the money is needed early in elections if you're going to build a relationship with people and not just come in at the last minute and ask for their vote. And we invested in Hampton Roads area, which is primarily African American, through an organization called the Black Leadership Organizing Collaborative, to try to strengthen that organization so it could build relationships and influence 2 House of Delegate seats. One was a good House of Delegate member, and another was to flip a seat. We retained the seat, and the Democratic candidate in the other seat that was running against the incumbent Republican dropped out a month before the election. The replacement candidate is now behind by 10 votes, and it's one of those that's being recounted in Virginia. You probably are aware there are a couple of seats that are still in contention. But again, in Virginia, there was lots of money flowing in Virginia, lots of influences there. But it was clear that, that the investments early, the investments through local community groups made a difference in that election. And one of the pieces of evidence for that is generally what you get is people that vote for governor, but then they fall off. They don't vote down ballot. Well, in fact, in Virginia, people that voted for a House of Delegate tended to vote for governor in higher numbers. There was about a 500, 600 vote advantage in every precinct from the down ballot up. So that was clear that people working in the local communities were really making a difference. There are a number of really great things about the people that won in Virginia. Lots of women, lots of people of color. The transgender candidate that won ran against the person who openly declared himself the leading homophobe in the House of Delegates. And she beat him. So there are a lot of interesting things that happened in that state, some of it because of the work of local community groups building relationships. And finally, we're working with some organizations that are trying to develop digital deep messaging. So everybody's fascinated with digital as a way to communicate with voters. Trump did it very effectively with Twitter, but most candidates are doing it. It's relatively inexpensive, but it's also relatively ineffective. When you get a tweet or a text from somebody you don't know, you tend to ignore it. So what these programs do are developing deep relationships with people. There's one called Push Black. And if you sign up for this, you see an ad for Push Black, you sign up, you get a text every couple of days from a guy named Daryl. And it's something about black history or black news. And people love it. There are now 700,000 people that have signed up in this relatively small program that started up. And 80% of those were because somebody referred them. So they initially, 20% signed up because they saw an ad, and then they referred it to their friends. So we're going to invest in this and try to take it to scale in a number of states. And so the way it works is you're giving somebody something of value. You're developing a relationship with them. People now are looking forward to these texts. An election is coming along, and you can say, hey, have you registered to vote? And they'll pay attention to that because it's coming from Daryl. They know Daryl. They've been getting messages from Daryl. And by the way, here's the person we think you might want to vote for, or here's a person that we think is not so good, and people will pay attention to that. The research that's been done on these programs early on is showing that it's more effective than almost any other way of reaching people, and really inexpensive. It's about $1.50 a vote. That California Calls program that I mentioned, where you have to go out and knock on doors, you have to knock on a door 3 times, and you only get about 15% of the people that answer their doors. That costs you about $75 to $150 a vote. So digital deep messaging has a lot of potential. It also can raise its own revenue and support itself. There's another program called Parents Together that gives parents something useful to talk to with their kids. We supported one that focused on Latinas. And when they pick up their kid from school, they get a text and says, here's how to talk to your kid about being bilingual. A lot of mothers are really struggling with it. They can't get their kids to be bilingual. They love this program. They get a text message from Nani about something to do with their kid that's fun and a way to get them to be bilingual. And then, by the way, there's an election coming up in a couple weeks. Have you talked to your kid about why elections matter? And are you registered? So that's a program that's also shows great potential. So the theme here is that if you can build relationships, people can get people to understand why their vote matters, and you talk to people in a way that pays attention to issues that they care about, and explain to them why those issues aren't going to be addressed unless they get involved and change who's making the decisions. We're going to have the system that we have now, and it's not going to get better. So that's the essence of our work. It's innovative probably in the sense that we're using these non-tax deductible dollars, C4 dollars, for good. You probably know of this category of funding as dark money. There are lots of organizations out there. It's called dark money because you don't have to reveal who funds you. So there's a lot of nefarious stuff going on. We're happy to say Atlantic Philanthropies funded us. We don't care. But we think that this is an approach that shows a lot of promise. We're out there selling it to other funders. We recognize that we're going to go out of business in the middle of 2020. We're trying to get other funders to see the value of this work. There's a lot of tech funders that have so much money they don't care about tax deductibility. They're starting to recognize the value of this. So the hope is that when we go out of business, there'll be a lot more interest and a lot more of this kind of political philanthropy out there. With that, I'm happy to stop and talk about whatever.
It seems that we're in a very different sort of political policy advocacy environment in November 2017 than we were on November 6th, 2016,
yeah.
Before the election. Is that accurate? And so, and how have your strategies changed as sort of, and if so, how have your strategies changed as a result?
Yeah, so I think the political environment is different. I think probably the most obvious difference is that the political discourse is just much harsher. We don't even pretend to be nice to each other anymore in the political environment. The partisanship, I think, is just kind of just more blatant, just like racism is more blatant, misogyny is more blatant. There's a lot of that kind of about the environment that is just much crasser. What's interesting, I think, is that there are a couple of things happening. The political parties are completely flummoxed. The Republican Party can't figure out like what to do because they've got this Tea Party wing on one end and you know, these insurgents on another, and traditional Republicans, which are a dying breed. I work for a Republican named John Hines. He would be a pretty moderate Democrat today, but at that time when I worked in the Congress, people worked across the aisle all the time. In fact, when I interviewed for my job with this guy, I said, I'll do your agent committee work, but I'm not going to do any of your political work. The fact that you're a Republican is your problem. I said that to him in the interview, and I thought at the time, maybe that wasn't really smart, but he was fine with that. But now, you can't even talk to somebody from the other side. I think the real difference that we're seeing out there, we're not sure what it means yet, is there are all these resistance groups that have emerged, starting from the Women's March the day after the election to, or the day after the inauguration, to groups called Flippable. There's one called Indivisible, mostly women, mostly white, mostly middle class, and they're out there kind of protesting, and people are trying to figure out, what does it mean? What do we do with that? Is that going to turn into a voting force? Can it be converted to a voting force? If it can't be, it's not going to have lasting impact. Our work, I think the thing that's probably happened, and it was happening even before the last election, is a recognition that it's very hard to get much done at the national level in Congress, because Congress is fairly dysfunctional, and there's more and more attention on states. And there needs to be more attention on the states, because the states have gerrymandered to the point that you don't have competition between two parties. You have a competition between the far right and the right, or in lesser cases, far left and the left. It's not between left and right much anymore because of gerrymandering, and then because of the role of money. Those are all forces, I think, that were in motion before this last election, but they've become more extreme. The resistance, I think, is probably the newest thing, and lots of us are trying to figure out how to capture that and make it work.
Are there other 501c4s like yours, or are they on the other side?
Yes, there are a lot on the other side. Koch Brothers, they support a lot of these kinds of organizations. You know, I mean, the NRA is generally not supporting the kind of people that we would support. In terms of philanthropy, because money is not tax deductible, there isn't, you know, there's not a lot of advantage to park your money somewhere because you're not getting anything for that. So you tend to have more individuals supporting this kind of work who are willing to support it. And so I think we're starting to see an increase in this kind of money on the good side. I think there's an increase on the other side as well. But more and more, I think individuals are recognizing that they have to engage in political activity, that there's a need for this infrastructure in communities to build long-term relationships. But it's still got a ways to go.
Yeah, I'm curious about, we talked at the end about funders not having to, or your organization, your civic organization not having to disclose its funders on all sides of the spectrum. I'm wondering, like, why that is, and if it's possible to have this type of work without that component. Without that component,
yeah. It is possible, and the IRS issued some draft regulations to change the way 501c4 organizations work, and it got such a blowback. It was kind of, there were a lot of problems with it, but it could work. I think a lot of people choose to put their money in a place where they don't have to be disclosed for a variety of reasons. Some are perfectly legitimate reasons. But I think what you're seeing is a lot of that is causing people to say, well, you know, if you're supporting a position, you ought to be willing to put your name out there. A lot of states require, California has very strict reporting requirements. It's very hard to do things in California without being pretty visible. But in many other places, the C4 entity allows that protection.
Is there a cap on what they contribute?
No. Again, it's independent expenditures. When you're contributing to a 527 or a candidate, there are caps. Though those have been loosened considerably by Citizens United. But in a C4 organization, you can spend as much as you want. Yeah. And there's a lot of money sloshing around out there. So. Roberto?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the actual intervention model that you're developing, because I mean, ensuring that there are more contacts with people with individuals who you're trying to mobilize to vote is sort of an expansion of a sort of traditional GOP type. It's just more contacts. The NRA or AARP is a totally different model entirely.
Right.
There you have your repeated contact with somebody over affiliation, a specific interest. And I'm not sure where your intervention falls on that spectrum.
So, when I was saying we started out being issue focused, we've become more agnostic about the issues in part because we're now recognizing that the issues should reflect what people care about in the community. So we're not pushing, like the NRA is pushing an issue, AARP has a set of positions. We're saying our goal is to engage people of color and low-income people on issues that matter to them. And so we're going to invest in ways that will connect with them on issues that matter to them, but then with the ultimate goal of getting them to participate in the system and to vote, essentially. So I think that's one difference between what we're supporting and what a lot of traditional organizations do. Many of the organizations we support have an issue agenda, but that's an agenda that they have presumably developed by working closely with the people that they represent in the community.
So you're relying on surrogates at the local level, fundamentally?
Yeah. Many of these organizations are nonprofit 501c3 organizations that have a 501c4 arm. So you can develop a C4 arm, and there's ways of doing accounting to make sure that those are kept separate. What we're finding is that the capacity on the 501c4 side in most communities is much more limited. They are really good on pushing issues. They're not very good in having an electoral strategy. So we're trying to beef that up. And I think that's really, these are not things that are fundamentally different than what's been done. I think they are really trying to take the concepts and take them to scale, to make sure that there is an electoral strategy in a community, because it's not enough just to push your issues and hope that the legislature will do something about it. And that really is a new approach for a lot of these places. There are a few states that are doing that well, most are not. They don't have an electoral strategy, but they increasingly are recognizing they have to, or they aren't going to get anything done. Rich, and then, okay, go ahead. Yeah, he's already asked a question.
How's what you're doing similar to or different from what the Koch brothers did with funding Tea Party organization?
So I think one of the things that the Koch brothers and a number of big funders on the right have done, and if you've read Dark Money or any of those books, they've invested in that infrastructure over a long period of time. They give money, and they give it for core support, and they say, we're here in the long term, and they incubate those organizations and grow them. On our side, we've done relatively little of that, and given that we're a short-term funder, we can only do so much of it, but our hope is that we can do the same thing, so that in effect, you've got a lasting infrastructure in the community that is representing the people that we care about, and at the very least, it will hold its own ultimately against what's been developed on the other side. But I think that's actually a good model, what they've done.
It was very successful.
It's very successful. I think what I hope is, so the gerrymandering that's happened in 25 states that have complete control by Republicans is pretty extreme. There is a similar kind of thing in Maryland, for example, which has an all-Democratic legislature and governor. It's been gerrymandered to favor the Democrats, but in general, Republicans are more effective at that. I would hope that we wouldn't just replace that in fact we create more competitive elections so you get a more representative government rather than just a government that's representing one extreme or the other. But the presence of that ongoing capacity to talk to people, to represent people's views, to encourage them to vote is necessary, whichever side of the aisle you're on. Somebody back there.
I was just curious, going back to the focus on the local level, what are the steps you take to vet the organizations you're going to fund to make sure that they are truly, addressing the needs of this population?
Really, really good question. So, in states that are well organized, they have tables. So they'll have a 501c4 table. A table is basically just a place that brings like-minded organizations together and coordinates their work. There's a 501c4 table in a number of states, a C3 table of nonprofit, tax-deductible organization, and a donor table. So we make sure that the organizations we're going to support are part of that table, that they've bought into the plan, that they're part of that larger community. And so the community is really vetting them. And if the community says they belong at this table, they're good actors, they follow through, we will either fund through the table to those organizations or fund them directly, but we won't fund them unless they're part of one of those tables. So we really rely on local groups. Many of these groups are part of national organizations. They're affiliates of national organizations. But we rely on people on the ground to say, this is a good organization. They can deliver on this, but they can't deliver on that, and we'll make sure that the funding aligns with what they can do.
I'm development director for a C3 that's in the process of starting up a C4. So I'm very familiar with that issue of a C3 that has way more capacity than its C4. So I'm wondering if you have seen examples among your grantees of organizations that were able to build really good long-term structure and capacity for their C4 organization.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to be clear about why you need a C4. So some organizations develop a C4 with just a little bit of money. It's hard money to raise, and you're the development director, you got to raise it, because donors don't get a tax deduction, so you got to convince them why they should do this. Some do it and they only raise a little bit of money, but it gives them the flexibility to go out and say something outrageous and not worry that they're going to lose their tax status, right? That's okay, but it's not a particularly useful thing. So being clear, why do you want a C4 and what do you need it for? If it's in fact to go that full direction, you either want to do maximum lobbying, you can do a lot of lobbying as a C3 organization. As long as you're not just getting only money from private foundations, you can do a lot. And you can do a 501H election and be very clear about what's allowed. So unlimited lobbying, but mostly that you want to get involved in electoral politics. And you don't have to go all the way to being partisan. If you want to get involved in some way in affecting who gets elected and how that happens, you need to have that capacity as a C4 and then figure out, well, what kind of resources do we need, and go from there. So there are a number of good examples. There are examples. I mentioned the New Virginia Majority. That's an organization I would look at, and they would be happy to talk with you about what they've done. There's an organization in Minnesota that is kind of a model for this. I can get you the information about them. And more organizations are developing a C4 arm. The legalities of it are fairly straightforward, but I think it's really about, can you raise the money, and do you know why you need to raise the money, what you're going to use it for? So I think being clear about that will be important. And if you want to go to a good website, the Alliance for Justice, they are the go-to place on everything related to C3s, C4s, what's legal, how you draw the lines, all that sort of stuff. So I'm sure you've already tapped into them, but they're a great resource.
Several years ago, when Roberto was on the board of the Independent Sector of Ohio's on an advisory council, right after the Citizens United case, the head of the Independent Sector said, this could be a really great opportunity for the nonprofit sector to actually get more involved in electoral politics. And I think there were several of us who said, this is an arms race that
we're going to lose.
That we cannot win, because it's mutually assured our destruction, because there's so much money on the other side.
Republicans know much more about making money than we do. That's
And your strategy is really a long-term strategy. So it's really ground up. So if you start with state and local government and work up, it's going to take a long time for a lot of the policies that affect most dramatically people of color and people in poverty, for those policies to change, for appointees to change, for judgeships to change. How do you sort of address that and not get discouraged.
So, so you try to chunk it down and say, okay, where can we have an effect? So in Arizona, for example, one reason we picked Arizona is that we wanted to focus on Latinos. We wanted to engage Latinos. Very low voter participation, below 50% in most elections. There's a lot of upside there. Second, the state Senate in Arizona, if you can flip 3 of those seats, you can change the makeup of the Senate. If you can do that, or you can change the governor, it's all Republicans now, you can change the governor, in 2020, there'll be a new census and there'll be redistricting that follows that. So we can say, in the state of Arizona, we can, by influencing the makeup of the Senate or the governorship, we can make sure that there's not going to be more gerrymandering after 2020 in that state. Now, we're hoping lots of other funders are joining us in other states, which is true. There's a big push in the Democracy Alliance is a collection of wealthy, progressive donors. They've created something called the State Victory Fund. They've raised $100 million for the next election cycle, 2018. They're on the way to raising $200 million, and it's all about redistricting and states. So even that is going to take a while, but the sense is that if we don't do that systematically, to your point, if we aren't building the case, building the infrastructure, one by one, making sure that at least there's somebody who's going to prevent bad things from happening in the next redistricting, we're just going to it's going to get worse. So I think so we look at the small victories, we look at the incremental change and try to focus on that. I think Virginia was a positive signal, and some of that creates its own momentum. But I've been around this public policy business long enough to know that if you get discouraged every time you lose, you're in therapy full time.
So I mean, there's no question the largest pool of untapped votes potentially on the progressive side are among Latinos. Everybody's known that for a long time, and there are lots and lots of people that have spent lots and lots of money in lots of different places,
right,
trying to change that dynamic, and they've all failed. What's the diagnosis that makes you think
that we can change it?
Yeah, that you've got a different approach.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you explain the fact that it's been such a stubborn problem?
Yeah. So you guys have somebody here, Manuel Pastor, who's an expert on Latino engagement in communities and so forth. And he's done a lot of research on this. I think there are some differing patterns about people who are recent immigrants and people that have been here a long time. I think his argument would be that if we're not focusing on those forces that are operating outside of individuals, we don't have, we can't be as successful affecting individual behavior. Atlantic's concept for that was catch the wave. Look for where there's something that's beginning to move and capture it. Immigration reform was that issue, but that's an issue that doesn't matter to Cubans in Florida. So you can't talk to Cubans in Florida about immigration reform, or Puerto Ricans, right?
Immigration reform didn't move votes among Latinos or Mexicans.
Yeah,
well, people directly, immediately, clearly, we just saw it in this election.
Yeah. There was some
participation went down.
No, but no, it went up. It went up in a few states, and it went up in those states where there was a real concerted effort to do GOTV, in Colorado, Nevada, and to a lesser extent in Florida. And so it is possible to increase it. Nobody has the magic formula, but the hope is that there are things like organizations developing relationships with people and trying to connect with them on what matters, not just picking immigration because it's a hot issue. It doesn't matter to big chunks of the population, but picking those, talking to them about issues that matter to them, the parents together concept, talking to people about something that they care about, and then encouraging them. I mean, we're trying a lot of things, but I don't think we believe we've got the answer. But it's a population that matters. It needs to be engaged, And big chunks of the political environment just ignore it because it's too difficult. And, you know, they got good evidence for that, right?
Yeah, including a lot of Latino politicians.
Yeah, well, although
Much
interestingly...
prefer, you know, you have a small capital electorate is much easier to manage than
Yeah.
opening it up.
But having a person from the community that the community connects with, I think there's evidence that that helps get people to show up and vote. So the Latino Victory Project is out recruiting Latino candidates across the country, and it's a way to begin to get people to want to participate. But if I can't say that we've got it figured out. We figure that it's worth the effort, and those places where we're working, if we can engage enough of them, it's going to take the rest of the population to be engaged as well. We can begin to make some changes in the makeup of the legislature, which will then have a positive effect, and hopefully convince people that there's a reason to vote.
As a Cuban from Miami, so are you attacking, like, in not that's a strong word, but like in every district, so Miami or Arizona or Los Angeles, is there a different plan of implementation because each one has different needs? Is that like every single Latino district because there's so many different ethnic groups?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it really is, you know, when we talk about the Latino vote, it is hugely diverse. I mean, Central Florida has large numbers of Puerto Ricans that are flowing in from Puerto Rico now in the thousands every day. That's a different population than Cubans in South Florida. Very different population than Hispanics, Latinos in Arizona, many of which are fourth and fifth generation and don't identify as Hispanic or Latino. They just don't see themselves that way, many of them, as opposed to newer immigrants in Los Angeles who are going to have a very different view. So the work really needs to be targeted to the population that you're trying to communicate with. And you can't do that on a national scale. You have to really, that has to be done by local groups in the community that have the connections. And many of them don't have the sophistication to do it. So part of it is building that capacity up so that they can talk to people. And a lot of it is not just, there's a lot of messaging research and focus groups and that sort of thing. Some of the more interesting stuff is really trying to get at basic values. What are the values of this population? You know, in the Hispanic community, there's a lot of conservative values that, you know, you can tap into, but you got to talk to them in a way that connects with what they care about. And I think there's increasing interest in that kind of values research from which messages can be developed. But the political environment is really all about just what's the message that we think will get people to show up, and that tend to focus on mid to high propensity voters. And for all the reasons that Roberto said, I mean, this is a hard nut to crack.
And with Cubans being like majority conservative, and I know it's more the older generation, is that like...
It's a generation, there's a generational flip going on in South Florida for sure. Yeah, I think Trump and Rubio are trying to pretend it's not there, but it's there. You know, right? Yeah, it's definitely, the younger people are in a very different place.
I want to follow up with the question that you were sort of hinting at with the Tea Party movement. They've been very successful both electorally, but also between elections. So what kind of work are you doing to keep the contact going between elections, not just focusing on the vote efforts?
Yeah.
And then second, what do you think is going to happen with this tax reform bill that passes for the kind of work you're trying to do? Not just for the 501c4s, but also for the 501c4s.
So the issue of what happens between elections is really the essence of what we're trying to deal with, because we know that sort of last minute contact has very limited payoff. So we're trying to make sure that organizations have the resources to work between elections. And we're working with a group of large funders to try to make sure that that happens. Some of the larger funders are funding capacity, core grants, rather than issue or project-based grants, with that idea that there needs to be a year-round connection with people. Otherwise, you're really just replicating what doesn't generally work among the political organizations. The tax bill, So there's a political side of the tax bill, which I think the tax bill is going to pass in some form. They are under so much pressure to get something done, they're going to hold their nose. It's sort of like Chuck Grassley said about the last attempt to undo the Affordable Care Act. He said, Republican leader said, there are 7 policy reasons to vote against this bill, but we made a promise. And I'm thinking, so that's what they're just going to hold. They know this. People earning under $30,000 are going to get a tax increase in 2019. People under $40,000 get a tax increase in 2021. And everybody under $75,000 is going to get a tax increase after 2027. So, so politically, if they pass it, I think the other side, the Democrats, are going to hammer them with it, and it's going to be politically challenging. In terms of its implications for the work, I don't think it affects tax deductibility of people contributing to the kinds of organizations that we're used to working with. There's some effect on endowments in universities and a few things like that, but I don't think they are affecting tax deductibility for nonprofits and that sort of thing in this bill. Churches will be able to do electoral work, which is going to be interesting. I'm not sure if that's a good idea, but it's...
The big thing for C3s, particularly social service C3s, is that the increase in standard deduction.
People will want to contribute less.
People will not itemize. People won't itemize.
And therefore may not contribute.
Right. That will have a dramatic impact.
That's
on
interesting.
The ability of those kinds of organizations to provide services.
Yeah.
And the repeal of the estate tax, which is a huge threat to foundation formation and to charitable giving.
Yeah. So everybody over who has more than $11 million, which side do they tend to give to? I don't know, but it's, yeah, there's a lot that's unknown. But I think the fallout from this tax bill is going to be something we're going to be dealing with politically and otherwise for quite some time. It's just tragic.
On that tragic note.
Can we have a positive note?